Have you ever seen this plane? This was the Blumenfast BV-141, the asymmetric plane, and at first glance you can tell that something was off about it. However, it aimed to solve one of the biggest problems in planes of its type, and despite how it looks, this was not a failure. There was simply another one that was partially better, which took the spot it was supposed to have in the Luftwaffe. But what was this plane? Why couldn't it be mass-produced? And more importantly, why did it have such a strange shape? Well, in the mid-1930s, with the new German government just coming into power, all branches of the German armed forces began to modernize. The Luftwaffe was no exception. Right in 1937, among all the new aircraft projects, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium issued a request that seemed ordinary at first glance, but in practice was a real challenge. They wanted a new reconnaissance aircraft, a general-purpose aircraft to replace the now obsolete Henschel HS-126. The requirements were quite simple, a single engine and capacity for 3 crew members. But the aircraft also had to have an outstanding field of view, which meant that the conventional design of wide wings near the cockpit was ruled out. That made manufacturers look for creative ways to give their prototypes superior visibility, since the plane with the best visibility would win and get the contract. 3 renowned companies took part in the preliminary tests: Arado, Focke-Wulf, and our main character, the very unconventional Blohm and Voss. Arado presented the plane that initially stood out the most to the evaluators, the AR-198, a single-engine monoplane just as required. The main improvement over the previous plane was in the fuselage center. It had an enlarged central glazed section that allowed for superior external visibility. However, in flight tests, it seemed to lack good agility and left much to be desired. Focke-Wulf presented a plane that was discarded from the very beginning. The FW-189 Uhu was a twin-tail, twin-engine aircraft that provided an almost complete 360-degree view. However, the designers failed to meet the main requirement of having a single engine. The single engine requirement was not random, nor was it to reduce costs. They wanted it that way because the High Command was looking for an aircraft that was extremely easy to repair on the battlefield. Having 2 engines was a big disadvantage compared to the other models. Finally, Blumenfast presented something that no one expected. The Blumenfast BV-141, designed by the company's chief designer, Dr. Richard Vogt, not only met all the requirements, but actually exceeded them. Instead of going with a conventional or already existing design, he literally created a new type of aircraft, the asymmetrical fuselage aircraft. The engine and all the mechanisms, as well as the storage section, were in the main part of the central fuselage, while on the right wing there was a plexiglass glazed gondola that provided total visibility of the surroundings. Although the layout might make it seem like it would have a tendency to rotate due to the weight distribution, in fact the low weight of the gondola and the large wings of the plane gave it enough lift that the plane practically flew like a normal one. The design was simply outrageous and very bold. It stole the attention of the evaluators from the start, for better or worse. It particularly caught the attention of one of the most important evaluators, the famous Ernest Udet. The other evaluators saw the BV-141 as something too radical, and since the proposal was only blueprints, calculations, and models, they decided to choose the FW-189 Shu as the new reconnaissance aircraft. The latter would begin production in 1940 with a total of 840 aircraft produced by the end of the conflict. It was one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aircraft. The BV-141, for its part, would not meet its end in those 1937 evaluations. The Ministry of Aviation would not approve its production, but BV would nevertheless continue development privately to prove that the concept had a future. Likewise, they created the HA-1410, the first prototype, with private funding. It flew for the first time in 1938, a flight that was witnessed by several representatives of the German Ministry of Aviation. This time they decided to fund the study of the concept, designating the HA-1410 as the BV-141B2. And so the company continued with the development, this time backed by the government. Months later, the BV-141B1 was created, a larger version with a gondola with large panels. Finally, at the end of 1936, the BV-141B3 was created, which was intended as a final production version. It was larger, had a widened landing gear, and various armaments, including a pair of forward-firing 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns and a pair of 7.92mm MG-15 machine guns facing aft. It also had 4 SC-50 bombs as well as a set of automatic cameras for reconnaissance. The Ministry of Aviation was delighted with the performance of the V3. However, there were still skeptics, so only about 5 units would be ordered for field evaluation. All of them would begin flying in 1939, right at the start of World War II. However, despite their good performance in everyday use, the Ministry of Aviation seemed to be deliberately postponing the adoption of the aircraft. They didn't dare to accept it, but they also didn't want to completely discard Dr. Richard Voigt's project. After all, the research was yielding very impressive results in the study of aeronautics. Finally, by 1940, Blumenfust presented an even more refined version of the V3, the BV-141A, in hopes of fully winning over the Ministry of Aviation. And after an official test, the ministry determined that although it had enough power, it would not be approved for production. Even so, Blumenfust would once again obtain private funding and create the final prototype, the definitive version of the asymmetric planes, the BV-141B. They put a BMW engine from the Junkers Ju-88 in this one to finally improve its apparent lack of power. They created an asymmetric stabilizer that improved agility, and in mid-1941, the Ministry of Aviation, impressed, requested 3 aircraft for field evaluation. And after a few months, Blumenfust, instead of receiving a letter of approval for production, got a huge file as thick as a book, full of problems found in the aircraft. It had both aerodynamic and structural problems, although the Ministry of Aviation also let them know that the aircraft was promising and that they would provide more funding to solve all the problems. They just needed even more development. Between the end of 1942 and the middle of 1943, even more versions were created, and the company kept refining the aircraft more and more to eliminate the problems that were found. However, the pace of improvement required was no longer the same as before the war. At that time, the war was at its peak. Immediate results were required, so when Blumenfust presented the final model in May 1943, the ministry decided to reject the aircraft and put a definitive end to the project. The BMW 801 engine no longer had a significant impact at that point in the conflict, and all those engines were already designated for use in their rivals, the FW-189 aircraft. It would later be revealed that the ministry never intended to mass-produce the BV-149. They were only keeping the research going to see if Blumenfust's team would come up with something noteworthy. That was the complete end of the iconic BV-141. Dr. Richard Voigt created several other asymmetric designs after the failed project, including the piston and jet-powered P-19401, but none of them were ever actually built. In fact, he made many asymmetric airplanes, and interestingly, they were actually quite promising. They met expectations, but they were simply designs that were too radical for their time. There were dozens of prototypes of the BV-141, but unfortunately all of them were destroyed by the Allied advance. Only one was recovered by the British and taken to England, but when they saw there was nothing useful in it, it was scrapped and discarded, so today this plane only remains on the margins. Why did the Germans carry this cylinder everywhere? En este video que tienes en pantalla verás la respuesta. Gracias por ver este video y adiós.